Elena moved through the cavernous halls of Don Alessio Romano's estate like a whisper, her presence meant to be felt only in the gleam of polished silver and the absence of dust on marble floors. On this Tuesday, however, her ghost-like efficiency was betrayed by a subtle limp she could not hide, a faint drag of her left foot that echoed her own internal weariness. As she meticulously polished a silver candelabra, she instinctively cradled her right wrist, a canvas of blooming purple and muted blue hidden beneath the cuff of her uniform. She worked through the sharp, radiating pain, her face a stoic mask of quiet endurance. In this world of silent, powerful men, the small, private wars of a woman like her were meant to be invisible, fought and lost in the shadows without ever disturbing the perfect, cold tranquility of the house. Her silent struggle was meant to go unnoticed, but in that house, every shadow had eyes. What those eyes saw would set in motion a terrifying act of salvation, and if you stay with us to the end, you will witness how a single moment of quiet observation can shatter two lives forever. Subscribe now, and let us know in the comments what you think he saw. Elena, at 29, had learned that dignity was a currency you minted yourself, in silence and solitude. Her job as a housekeeper was less a profession and more a performance of invisibility, a daily act of disappearing into the background of a life that was not her own. She carried the weight of a past that had stripped her of youthful dreams, leaving behind a quiet resilience and a profound loneliness that clung to her like the scent of lemon polish. Her moral compass, though battered by the world's indifference, remained her only true possession. It was this unwavering sense of right and wrong that kept her upright, even as her body ached, and her spirit felt perilously close to collapsing under the strain of a life lived on the periphery of power and wealth. The estate itself was a gilded cage, a monument to a power so immense it was suffocating. The air was always still, chilled by the central air system, and smelled of old leather, cigar smoke, and something metallic, like ambition. Her footsteps, soft as they were, seemed to thunder in the oppressive silence of the long, art-lined corridors. The only other sounds were the distant, muted hum of Chicago traffic far below the penthouse windows and the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the foyer, each second a reminder of the time she was losing. This opulence was not comforting. It was a constant, glaring reminder of her own powerlessness, a world she could clean but never touch, a life she could observe but never inhabit. The bruises were a map of her other life, the one she returned to each night in a small, cramped apartment across town. They were the punctuation marks in the story of a marriage built on loud words and heavy hands, a union she remained in due to a suffocating combination of fear and financial debt. She had once dreamed of being an architect, of building beautiful things, but now she spent her days maintaining them for others, her nights trying to remain small enough to go unseen. Her sense of justice screamed inside her, a silent, desperate plea for fairness in a world that seemed to reward cruelty and punish kindness. She endured it all with a quiet resolve, believing that survival was its own form of victory, a temporary truce in an unwinnable war. She understood the chasm between her world and his. Her reality was one of scrubbing floors, of worrying about overdue bills, of hiding her pain behind a carefully constructed facade of normalcy. His was a world of whispered phone calls, of meetings in smoke-filled rooms where the fate of men was decided over glasses of expensive whiskey. He was the unseen gravity that held this entire universe together, a man whose name was spoken with a mixture of reverence and fear throughout the city. Elena felt his presence not as a person, but as an atmosphere, a low-frequency hum of absolute control that permeated the very walls she spent her days cleaning. The contrast was a constant, aching reminder of the fragility of her own existence. As the afternoon sun cast long, distorted shadows across the polished floor, Elena felt a change in the atmosphere. It wasn't a sound or a movement, but a sudden, prickling awareness on the back of her neck, the undeniable feeling of being watched. It was not the casual, dismissive glance of a subordinate or the leering stare she had grown accustomed to in the outside world. This was a gaze that was heavy, analytical, and unnerving in its intensity. It stripped away her uniform, her practiced invisibility, and seemed to peer directly into the carefully guarded fortress of her soul. The silence in the room was no longer empty. It was charged, watchful, and for the first time, she felt a tremor of a fear that was entirely new. The heavy oak door of the Romano estate closed behind her with a soft, definitive click, sealing away the world of silent luxury and casting her out into the damp chill of the Chicago evening. The transition was always jarring, a physical shock that pulled her from the rarefied air of polished marble into the gritty reality of the city. As she walked down the long, private drive toward the distant glow of the streetlights, the uniform she wore suddenly felt like a costume, a thin layer of borrowed respectability that would soon be shed. The ache in her wrist throbbed in time with her weary footsteps on the pavement, a rhythmic reminder of the life that awaited her beyond these gilded gates. A world where she was not invisible but a target, where silence was not a professional requirement but a tool for survival. The ride home was a blur of humanity pressed too close. The city bus, steamy with the breath of tired commuters, smelled of wet wool and exhaust fumes. Elena found a small space to stand, her hand gripping a cold metal pole, her gaze fixed on her own faint reflection in the darkened window. She saw a woman with weary eyes, her face a carefully composed mask of neutrality. Around her, people were lost in their own worlds, their faces illuminated by the blue light of their phones, their expressions ranging from exhausted to numb. She was just another anonymous figure in the nightly migration from the city's affluent heart to its struggling, forgotten arteries, a ghost moving between two worlds but truly belonging to neither. Her neighborhood greeted her with cracked sidewalks and the inconsistent hum of flickering streetlights. The buildings stood shoulder to shoulder, their brick facades worn by decades of harsh winters and unfulfilled promises. This was a place of survival, not aspiration. The air carried the scent of fried food from a corner diner and the distant wail of a siren, the constant, mournful soundtrack of her life. Each step toward her apartment building felt heavier than the last, the brief respite of her workday dissolving into the familiar dread that settled in the pit of her stomach. Here, there were no grand corridors or priceless art, only narrow hallways that smelled of stale cigarettes and the quiet desperation of lives lived on the margin. Her apartment was a small, cramped space where the walls felt like they were slowly closing in. She fought against the encroaching chaos with a fierce, quiet determination, keeping what little she had meticulously clean and organized. A single, resilient succulent sat on the windowsill, its stubborn green, a small act of defiance against the urban gray outside. This was her sanctuary and her prison. It was where she could finally let the mask slip, where the exhaustion was allowed to show in the slump of her shoulders. It was also the place where she was most vulnerable, where the silence was often broken by the sound of a key in the lock, a sound that made her heart seize with a cold, practiced fear. The source of that fear was already home. Mark sat slumped in the threadbare armchair, the television blaring a mindless game show, a half-empty bottle of whiskey sweating on the end table beside him. His presence filled the small apartment, sucking the air out of the room. He didn't look at her as she entered, but she felt his gaze on her, heavy and resentful. He was a man hollowed out by his own failures, and he had made it his life's work to carve that same hollowness into her. His bitterness was a tangible thing, a toxic fog that clung to the furniture and stained the very air she breathed. She moved quietly, her actions precise and economical, trying to make herself smaller, less of a target. "You smell like them," he slurred, his eyes finally lifting from the television to fix on her. The words were not an observation, but an accusation. "Like money you didn't earn." She didn't respond, continuing to put away her meager groceries. Her silence was a canvas onto which he painted his own insecurities, cleaning up after him, polishing his silver while I'm out here breaking my back for nothing. Does he talk to you? Does the great Don Alessio Romano even know you exist? Each question was a sharp jab, designed to strip away her dignity, to remind her that even her escape was just another form of servitude, one that somehow made his own situation feel even more pathetic. The argument escalated, as it always did. It began with money. his voice rising in volume with each perceived slight, each bill they couldn't pay. When words failed to have their desired effect, his frustration boiled over. He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into the tender flesh above her elbow. "Look at me when I'm talking to you," he snarled, his face inches from hers. Elena stood perfectly still, her gaze fixed on a crack in the plaster on the wall behind him. She had learned this response over years of practice. To retreat deep inside herself, to a place he couldn't touch, to let the storm break over her while she waited for the inevitable, painful calm that would follow. Later, after he had spent the last of his rage and stumbled into the bedroom, she was left in the wreckage of the evening. She sat at the small kitchen table, the silence of the apartment now a roaring in her ears. The pain in her wrist had sharpened to a fine point, a physical manifestation of her trapped existence. In the quiet darkness, the architect she had once dreamed of becoming wept for the woman she was now. She had wanted to build beautiful, lasting things, structures that provided shelter and safety. Instead, her life was a constant act of patching up cracks, of bracing for the next impact, of trying to hold together a foundation that was designed to crumble. The next morning was a ritual of concealment. Under the harsh light of the bathroom mirror, she carefully applied concealer to the new bruise blooming on her cheek, a faint, shadowy testament to the previous night's storm. She moved with a practiced slowness, her body a map of aches, both old and new. The uniform, once she put it on, felt less like a costume and more like armor, its crisp fabric a shield against the world's intrusive gaze. As she rode the bus back into the city, watching the familiar landscape slide by, she felt a profound sense of detachment, as if she were watching a film of someone else's life, a sad, repetitive story with no clear end in sight. Back within the silent, opulent walls of the estate, the day began, as it always did. She was assigned to the main library, a vast, two-story room filled with the scent of leather and aging paper. As she carefully dusted a row of leather-bound books, her injured wrist gave a sudden, sharp jolt of pain, causing her to lose her grip on a small porcelain figurine. It fell to the thick Persian rug with a soft, harmless thud, but the sound was enough. Mr. Henderson, the stern house manager, materialized from the shadows. "Clumsy," he hissed, his voice a blade in the quiet room. "Your only job is to be careful and invisible. Is that too much to ask?" The public humiliation, small as it was, felt immense. Her cheeks burned with shame as she bent to retrieve the object, unaware that from the deep shadows of a leather armchair in the far corner of the room, a pair of dark, unblinking eyes had witnessed it all. From the deepest corner of the library, a figure detached itself from the shadows. Don Alessio Romano rose from the depths of a high-backed leather armchair, a place where he had been observing, unseen and unheard. He was a man sculpted from silence and authority, his form encased in a flawlessly tailored dark suit that seemed to absorb the dim light of the room. He moved with a liquid grace that was both elegant and predatory, each step deliberate and soundless on the plush carpet. Around him, the very air seemed to grow still and heavy, charged with a respectful quiet that was more profound than mere silence. It was the hush that falls in the presence of absolute, unquestionable power, a force that needed no announcement to be felt. His face was a study in controlled impassivity, a handsome but severe landscape of sharp angles and disciplined lines. Yet, it was his eyes that held the true weight of his existence. They were dark, intelligent, and carried the profound weariness of a man who had seen too much and was responsible for even more. They were the eyes of a ruler, a strategist, and a killer, but deep within their obsidian depths, a flicker of an old, unhealed wound could be glimpsed, a ghost of guilt that time had failed to exorcise. As he approached, he didn't even glance at Elena. His entire focus was fixed on the cowering house manager, his gaze a physical weight that pinned the man in place. Alessio stopped before Mr. Henderson, his taller frame casting a long, imposing shadow over the smaller man. He didn't speak immediately, letting the silence stretch into an instrument of intimidation. When he finally did, his voice was not a shout, but a low, resonant murmur, a sound so quiet that Elena had to strain to hear it, yet it carried the chilling finality of a death sentence. "You will gather your things," Alessio said, the words smooth and cold as polished steel. "You will not speak to anyone on your way out. Your presence in this house is no longer required." It was not a dismissal. It was an erasure. Henderson's face turned a pasty white, his mouth opening and closing silently like a fish out of water. The manager, stripped of all his petty authority, simply nodded, a jerky, terrified motion. He turned and practically fled from the library, his hurried footsteps a discordant sound in the cathedral-like quiet. Alessio watched him go, his expression unchanging, before his attention shifted, slowly and deliberately, turning the full force of his presence toward the corner where Elena stood frozen. The vast room suddenly felt small, the air thick and difficult to breathe. She was alone with him, the unseen architect of Chicago's underworld, and the silence he left in his wake was more terrifying than any shouting she had ever endured. She braced herself for her own dismissal, for the cold words that would cast her out. But the words never came. Instead, he walked past her, his proximity a wave of palpable energy. She felt the subtle warmth from his body, and caught the faint, clean scent of expensive cologne and something else, something sharper, like cold night air and old secrets. He didn't stop to address her, but continued to the small table where the porcelain figurine lay on the rug. He bent down in one fluid motion, his powerful frame moving with an unexpected grace. It was a simple action, yet it was imbued with a significance that made Elena's heart hammer against her ribs. He was occupying her space, entering the small circle of her failure and humiliation, and she had no idea what to expect. His hands, which she had only ever seen in newspaper photos, were large and bore the faint, silvery tracings of old scars across the knuckles. They were hands that had undoubtedly signed orders and ended lives. Yet, as he picked up the delicate porcelain shepherdess, his touch was impossibly gentle. He held the small, fragile object in his palm for a long moment, his thumb brushing away a speck of dust with a careful, almost tender precision. He was not just looking at the figurine, he was studying it, his focus absolute. In that small, quiet gesture, Elena witnessed a contradiction that unsettled her to her core. The capacity for great violence and meticulous care existing within the same man. After a moment that felt like an eternity, he placed the figurine back on its shelf, his movements economical and exact. Only then did he turn his head and finally, truly, look at her. His gaze was not leering or dismissive. It was something far more unnerving. It was an intense, analytical assessment that stripped away her uniform and her carefully constructed composure. He saw the faint purple shadow on her cheek that her makeup hadn't quite concealed. He saw the way she cradled her wrist. He saw the fear in her eyes, but also the flicker of defiance that refused to be extinguished. It was a gaze that didn't just see her. It dissected her, inventoried her pain, and filed it away for some unknown purpose. He held her stare for a few seconds longer, a silent, unnerving communion that felt more intimate than any touch. In his eyes, she saw no pity, no sympathy, only a deep, unsettling understanding. It was the look of a man who recognized the landscape of pain because he was a master of creating it, and perhaps of enduring it himself. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture so small it could have been imagined. It wasn't an act of reassurance or kindness. It was an acknowledgement. An acknowledgement of her struggle, of her presence in his world. And then, just as quietly as he had appeared, he turned and walked away. His footsteps were completely silent on the thick rug as he vanished back into the labyrinthine corridors of the estate, leaving her alone in the immense, echoing library. The room was empty again, but the atmosphere was irrevocably changed. His presence lingered like the charge after a lightning strike, a low hum of power that vibrated in the very air she breathed. She felt strangely exposed, as if he had peeled back a layer of her soul and looked at what lay beneath. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was now tangled with something else, a confusing and dangerous flicker of being seen by someone who missed nothing. Elena slowly let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her hand instinctively going to the cheek he had noticed. The silence he left behind was no longer empty. It was filled with the weight of his unspoken observation. He hadn't saved her with grand words or a heroic act, but with a quiet, brutal display of power that had, incidentally, shielded her. She did not feel grateful. She felt marked. In that silent, cavernous room, she understood that her carefully maintained invisibility had been shattered. Don Alessio Romano knew she existed, and in his world, being noticed was the most dangerous thing of all. A new kind of dread, colder and more profound than any she had known, began to settle over her. The days that followed were a study in charged silence. Elena moved through the estate not as a ghost, but as a nerve ending, acutely aware of every shift in the atmosphere. The house, once a place of oppressive anonymity, was now a stage where she was the unwilling lead in a play she did not understand. She tried to reclaim her invisibility, focusing on the minute details of her work, the precise angle of a folded napkin, the streak-free gleam of a window pane, but it was a futile effort. His presence was a constant, low hum beneath the quiet surface of the house. She would feel a prickling on her skin and look up to find him standing at the far end of a corridor, watching her, his expression an unreadable mask of cool observation before he would turn and disappear. She began to map his habits, not by choice, but by a primal instinct for survival. She learned the sound of his custom-made leather shoes on the marble floors, a soft, measured tread that was entirely different from the hurried clicks of his men. She knew the scent of his cologne, a subtle blend of sandalwood and something cold, like winter air, that would linger in a room long after he had gone. These sensory details were the new parameters of her existence, a constant, unnerving reminder that she was no longer just an employee. She was an object of his focus, a puzzle he seemed determined to solve, and the intensity of his quiet scrutiny was more unsettling than any threat she had ever faced. He never sought her out directly, yet their paths seemed to cross with an almost orchestrated frequency. She would be in the conservatory tending to the orchids, and he would appear to take a phone call, his back to her, but his reflection captured in the glass, his eyes occasionally flicking toward hers. Or she would be restocking linens in a quiet upper hallway, and the door to his private study would open, forcing a moment of shared space and a brief, loaded glance before she would hurry away, her heart hammering against her ribs. These were not coincidences. She knew it with a certainty that chilled her. They were tests, observations, a slow, deliberate closing of the distance between their two worlds. One rainy afternoon, she sought refuge in the cavernous library, a room she now associated with the beginning of her strange new life. She ran a hand over the spine of a worn copy of Moby Dick, tracing the gold lettering, lost for a moment in the memory of a time when books were her only escape. He is a symbol of the destructive nature of obsession. A low voice commented from behind her. She turned, startled, to find Alessio standing just a few feet away. He had moved with his customary silence. He was not looking at her, but at the book in her hands. The observation hung in the air between them, a statement that was about far more than a 19th century novel. Elena felt her voice catch in her throat, her mind racing. Was he talking about Captain Ahab, or was he talking about himself? The ambiguity was a form of power, a way of drawing her into his confidence without revealing anything at all. Or perhaps, she managed, her voice barely a whisper, he is just a man who has lost too much and doesn't know how to stop fighting. The words were out before she could stop them, a raw, honest response that surprised them both. For a split second, the mask of the dawn slipped, and she saw a flicker of something vulnerable in his eyes, a brief, unguarded acknowledgement of a shared truth before the cool composure returned, harder and more impenetrable than before. He did not reply to her comment. Instead, he simply inclined his head, a gesture of concession or perhaps dismissal, she couldn't be sure. He walked over to a globe in the corner, spinning it slowly with one finger, his attention seemingly captured by the movement of continents beneath his touch. The silence that fell was different from the ones before. It was no longer just tense. It was filled with the weight of what she had said, the small piece of her soul she had inadvertently shown him. She felt dangerously exposed, having dared to see the man behind the myth. He was no longer just her protector. He was a man with wounds, and that, she realized, made him infinitely more dangerous. This growing awareness became a constant battle within her. The fear of him, of the casual violence he commanded, was a cold, solid presence in her gut. He was a killer. The man who had tormented her was gone because of a quiet order from him. This fact should have made her hate him, should have made her run. Yet, intertwined with that fear was a confusing thread of gratitude and a terrifying magnetic pull. In his presence, for the first time in years, she felt a profound, albeit perilous, sense of safety. He had seen her weakness and her pain, and instead of exploiting it, he had shielded it. This contradiction was the source of her torment, a moral paradox she could not solve. He, too, was fighting a war she could not see. Her quiet dignity was a mirror, reflecting back at him a version of the world he had long since abandoned. In her eyes, he saw not the fear and sycophantic respect he was accustomed to, but a clear, unwavering moral judgment that both condemned and intrigued him. She did not flatter him or cower excessively. She simply existed, her honesty a silent rebuke to the empire of lies and violence he had built. He found himself altering his path through the house just for the possibility of seeing her, a compulsion he could neither understand nor control. She was a flicker of light in his self-imposed darkness, and he was drawn to it like a moth to a flame, knowing it had the power to burn him. The physical tension between them became a palpable entity, an invisible current that charged the air whenever they were near. It was in the way their eyes would meet and hold for a fraction of a second too long across a crowded room. It was in the careful, deliberate distance they maintained, a space that felt more intimate than any touch. He seemed to possess a heightened awareness of her body, not in a leering way, but in how he would subtly shift his position to shield her from the view of another man, or how his gaze would momentarily soften when he saw the exhaustion she tried so hard to hide. Every small, unspoken gesture added another layer to their complex, dangerous bond. One evening, as she was leaving, a sudden, violent thunderstorm broke over the city, turning the streets into raging rivers. She stood under the portico, watching the deluge, knowing the buses would be delayed for hours. A sleek, black car, the same one she knew belonged to him, pulled up silently beside her. The back window glided down, revealing Alessio in the dimly lit interior. "Get in," he said. "It was not a request. I will see you home." The offer was a minefield of implications. To accept was to step further into his world, to acknowledge a connection beyond that of employer and employee. To refuse was to defy him, an act she knew could have untold consequences. Her heart pounded as she slid onto the cool leather seat. The interior of the car was an extension of him, silent, luxurious, and smelling faintly of his cologne. The storm raged outside, but inside the vehicle, there was an almost unnerving stillness. The drive was made in complete silence, the only sounds the rhythmic swish of the windshield wipers and the soft hum of the engine. She stared out the window at the blurred city lights, hyper-aware of him sitting just a few feet away. She could feel the warmth of his body, the sheer physical presence of him, filling the confined space. The air was thick with unspoken words, with the monumental truth of what he had done for her. As the car approached her rundown apartment building, a place that stood in stark contrast to the opulence she had just left, a sense of shame washed over her. He was seeing the full scope of her old life, the cage he had freed her from. The driver pulled to the curb, but Alessio made no move to let her out. He simply looked at the building, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "This is no place for you," he stated, his voice a low murmur. It was a simple observation, devoid of pity, but it carried the weight of a verdict. He was not just seeing her apartment. He was seeing the entirety of her struggle. And in his world, such vulnerability was a liability. She turned to face him, a spark of her old defiance flaring. "It is my home," she said, her voice quiet but firm. His eyes met hers, and in their depths, she saw a flicker of respect. He held her gaze, and the space between them seemed to shrink, the air growing heavy and charged. He reached out, not to touch her, but to brush a stray strand of rain-dampened hair from her cheek. The gesture was shockingly gentle, his fingertips barely grazing her skin, but it sent a jolt of electricity through her entire body. It was an act of ownership, of tenderness, and of profound danger, all at once. The touch was brief, but it lingered like a brand. Suddenly, the car was bathed in the harsh glare of headlights. A dark sedan had pulled up aggressively behind them, its engine rumbling, a clear and menacing challenge. Alessio's demeanor shifted instantly. The brief moment of intimacy vanished, replaced by the lethal calm of a predator. His hand, which had been so gentle moments before, dropped away, and his eyes narrowed, becoming cold, flat stones. He gave a quiet, single-word instruction to his driver, his voice like ice. The tension inside the car was now razor-sharp, a tangible threat that had nothing to do with their personal connection and everything to do with the violent world he commanded. He turned back to her, his face a hard, emotionless mask. "Stay in the car. Do not get out, no matter what you hear." His voice was low, authoritative, leaving no room for argument. He opened his door and stepped out into the pouring rain, his broad shoulders squared as he faced the men emerging from the other vehicle. He was a king standing before usurpers, his very presence a declaration of war. Elena watched through the rain-streaked window, her breath caught in her throat, a prisoner in his gilded cage on wheels. She was witnessing firsthand the consequences of his protection. The men who got out of the sedan were not his. She could tell by their arrogant posture, by the way they held themselves as if they owned the street. They were rivals, predators from another pack who had scented weakness or opportunity. They had followed him, or perhaps they had been watching her. The thought sent a new wave of ice-cold terror through her veins. Had his interest in her made her a target? Was his protection not a shield, but a spotlight, illuminating her for every other monster hiding in the city's shadows? She watched as Alessio spoke to the men, his body language relaxed, but radiating a deadly stillness. The rain plastered his dark suit to his frame, but he seemed oblivious to it. She couldn't hear the words, but she could see the confrontation escalate in the tightening of jaws and the subtle shift in stances. This was his reality, a world where disagreements were settled not with contracts, but with violence on rain-slicked city streets. She had been saved from one monster, only to be delivered into the heart of a war between them, and the man standing in the storm, ready to kill for her, was the most terrifying of them all. The muffled sounds of the argument outside were a distorted symphony of aggression. Rain hammered against the roof of the car, a frantic percussion beneath the low, menacing rumble of male voices. Elena pressed herself against the door, trying to decipher the words, but they were lost to the storm. She could see the scene in fractured glimpses, through the water streaming down the window, the rigid set of Alessio's shoulders, the contemptuous sneer on the face of the man opposite him. They were talking about her. She knew it with a sickening certainty. She was the reason for this confrontation, a piece of property being disputed on a dark, wet street. His order to stay in the car was a cage within a cage, and the instinct to remain invisible warred with a terrifying new urge to act, to scream, to do anything but sit helplessly by. Then, a single phrase cut through the noise, carried on a gust of wind as the rival leader leaned in, his voice dripping with venom, loud enough for her to hear. "You've gone soft, Romano, hiding behind a little housekeeper." The words were a deliberate violation, designed to strip away Alessio's power by mocking its new, inexplicable focus. But for Elena, they were a branding iron. Little housekeeper. The phrase erased her name, her identity, her silent struggle, reducing her to a symbol of weakness. In that instant, her fear was burned away by a white-hot surge of indignation. It was not just an insult to him, it was a dismissal of her very existence, and her soul, so long accustomed to quiet endurance, refused to accept it. A definitive click echoed in the silent interior of the car as she unlocked the door. It was a sound of rebellion, a conscious act of self-destruction. Pushing against the heavy, armored door, she stepped out into the deluge. The cold shock of the rain was immediate and absolute, soaking her thin uniform in seconds, plastering her hair to her scalp. The world, once muffled and distant, came rushing in with a deafening roar, The storm, the idling engines, the sudden, sharp intake of breath from the men who now turned to stare at her. She was no longer a ghost or a prize. She was a woman standing in a storm, her eyes fixed on the man who had insulted her, her presence a question mark in a deadly equation. Alessio's face was a mask of cold fury as he saw her. For a fraction of a second, his control fractured, revealing a flash of something akin to panic in his dark eyes. He was furious at her for her defiance, for placing herself directly in the line of fire, for shattering the perfect cold bubble of his protection. The rival leader's lips curled into a triumphant, ugly smile. He had found the crack in Romano's armor. "See?" he taunted, taking a deliberate, menacing step toward her. "She comes when she's called." He had miscalculated. He thought he was provoking a rival. He did not understand that he had just threatened something Alessio now considered, in some primal, unspoken way, his own. The carefully constructed facade of Don Alessio Romano, the impassive strategist, the cold commander, disintegrated. He moved not with the fluid grace she had seen before, but with a brutal, explosive velocity that was terrifying to behold. It was not a calculated act of violence. It was pure, predatory instinct unleashed. He closed the distance between himself and the rival in a blur of motion, his body a weapon of controlled rage. There was no negotiation, no final warning. There was only the sickening, solid sound of bone connecting with fist, a sound that seemed to cut through the noise of the storm and echo in the sudden, ringing silence of the street. It was the sound of a king breaking his own rules. The confrontation was over before it had truly begun. It was not a fight. It was an execution of dominance. The rival leader crumpled to the wet asphalt, and his men, who had been posturing with such arrogance moments before, froze, their faces a mixture of shock and raw fear. They saw what Elena now saw. This was not a business transaction. This was personal. Alessio stood over the fallen man, his chest rising and falling with deep, controlled breaths, the rain washing the blood from his knuckles. He had exposed himself, not as a powerful Don, but as a man who had been pushed past a limit he perhaps didn't even know he had, all for a woman he barely knew. The street fell into a profound quiet, broken only by the steady drumming of the rain on the pavement. The remaining rivals scrambled back to their car, a silent, hasty retreat from a force they now understood they could not challenge. Alessio did not watch them go. He remained perfectly still for a long moment, a dark, solitary figure in the downpour, as if coming to terms with the beast he had just unleashed. He had shattered his own unwritten code. Never show emotion, never reveal a vulnerability, never kill for anything but power or necessity. He had just done all three. He had acted not as a boss, but as a protector, and the line between the two had been irrevocably blurred. Then he turned. His eyes found hers through the sheets of rain, and they were dark, wild, and filled with a terrifying intensity. He strode toward her, closing the space between them with 3 long, purposeful steps. He grabbed her upper arm, his grip not cruel, but possessively tight, an anchor in the storm of his own making. He didn't speak. He simply pulled her back toward the open door of the car, his touch, a brand of ownership. A silent, furious declaration. This was his, and what was his, he protected. She stumbled along with him, her mind reeling, her body trembling not from the cold, but from the raw, untamed power she had just witnessed, being wielded on her behalf. He pushed her into the car, his movements efficient and rough, before sliding in beside her and slamming the door shut. The world outside was once again muted, the violence contained. They were plunged back into a suffocating, intimate silence. He did not look at her. He stared straight ahead through the windshield, his jaw tight, a muscle twitching in his cheek. His knuckles were split and bleeding, staining the pristine leather of the seat where his hand rested. She could feel the heat radiating from him, the lingering adrenaline of the fight, the sheer force of his will as he wrestled his control back into place. He had saved her again, but this time she had seen the cost. The car pulled away from the curb, its tires hissing on the wet pavement, leaving the scene of violence behind as if it had never happened. But it had. It existed in the space between them, a silent, screaming testament to their transgression. He had broken his code of cold detachment, and she had broken her code of silent survival. There was no going back to the quiet anonymity of before. The polished marble halls of his estate were no longer a workplace. They were the heart of a dangerous new reality she now inhabited. In the profound silence of the ride, she understood that he had not just protected her body, he had laid claim to her life. The ride back was a journey through a vacuum. The car, a hermetically sealed capsule of luxury, moved silently through the rain-washed city, but the true silence was inside, a dense, suffocating weight between them. Elena sat rigidly, the dampness of her uniform chilling her to the bone, hyper-aware of the blood drying on his knuckles and the cold fury radiating from him like a magnetic field. When the car stopped in front of a new building, one she had never seen before, he did not look at her. He simply said, "This is your new residence. You will be safe here." The words were clipped, devoid of all emotion, a transaction completed. He did not get out. He did not watch her go. The door closed, and the car vanished into the night, leaving her on the curb, a key in her hand and a chasm in her heart. The apartment was beautiful, sterile, and utterly soulless. It was a high-rise fortress with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking, panoramic view of the Chicago skyline. It was also a gilded cage, more luxurious than her last, but a cage all the same. She walked through the empty, echoing rooms, her footsteps silent on the plush carpeting. There was no clutter, no history, no life. It was a space designed for safety, not for living. Standing before the vast window, she watched the distant, silent dance of headlights on the wet streets below. The city looked like a galaxy of jewels, but she had never felt more alone. The violent, protective warmth of his presence had been replaced by this cold, perfect emptiness, and the void he left was more terrifying than the storm had ever been. Her return to the estate the following day was a walk through a minefield of whispers and averted gazes. The atmosphere, once merely oppressive, was now actively hostile. The other staff members, who had once ignored her, now watched her with a mixture of fear, resentment, and morbid curiosity. She was no longer Elena, the quiet housekeeper. She was the Don's problem, the Don's weakness, the reason for a violent schism in their carefully ordered world. She was marked, an outcast in both her old life and this one. She performed her duties with meticulous, almost frantic precision, polishing silver and dusting marble as if her life depended on it, trying to scrub away the invisible brand of his protection that now felt more like a curse. Alessio retreated into the shadows of his own empire. He was a ghost in his own house, a man wrestling with the consequences of an impulse he could not afford. The incident on the street had sent ripples through the underworld. Rivals saw a crack in his armor, and allies questioned his judgment. He spent his days in his study, the door firmly closed, his voice a low, dangerous murmur on the phone as he systematically reasserted his dominance, one quiet threat at a time. He was rebuilding the wall of fear and respect that had defined him, and the first brick in that wall was the distance he placed between himself and Elena. Protecting her now required a different kind of violence, the cold, calculated cruelty of complete and total separation. For Elena, the moral calculus of her new life became an agonizing, sleepless burden. She lived in a sanctuary paid for by blood money. She ate food bought with the profits of extortion and fear. She was safe because a man had brutalized another man in front of her. The memory of that sound, that sickening thud of fist on bone, played on a loop in her mind. Her sense of justice, the very core of her being, was in turmoil. Was this survival? Or was it a different kind of imprisonment? A complicity that stained her soul far more deeply than any bruise ever could. The quiet dignity she had fought so hard to maintain felt like a fraud, a relic from a life that no longer existed. She was safe, but she had lost the moral ground on which she stood. Weeks bled into a month, and the silence from him was absolute. He was in the house, She could feel his presence like a change in barometric pressure, but he remained unseen, a phantom haunting the periphery of her world. The evidence of his invisible watchfulness was everywhere. A discreet security car parked down the street from her new building, the sudden, deferential respect she received from shopkeepers in her neighborhood. But the man himself was gone. The distance was a deliberate, painful act of excision. He had surgically removed himself from her daily life, leaving behind a clean, deep wound that refused to heal. The loneliness was a physical ache, a constant, throbbing reminder of the connection that had been severed. One late afternoon, as she was replacing faded flowers in a large vase in the main hall, she saw him. Not in person, but as a fleeting reflection in the polished surface of a grandfather clock. He was walking down the upper gallery, his silhouette a slash of darkness against the fading light. For a single, breathless second, their eyes met in the distorted glass. She saw the profound exhaustion etched onto his features, the crushing weight of the world he carried. He saw her, solitary and small in the vast, empty hall. There was no anger in his reflection, only a deep, melancholic resignation. Then, he was gone, the moment dissolving as quickly as it had formed, leaving only the relentless, rhythmic ticking of the clock. In the hollow echo of his absence, something within Elena began to shift. The raw pain of abandonment and the turmoil of her conscience slowly began to transmute into a quiet, painful clarity. She began to understand that his withdrawal was not a punishment, but the only true act of protection he could offer. To keep her in his orbit was to paint a permanent target on her back. By pushing her away, by becoming a ghost, he was absorbing all the danger himself. He had saved her from her husband, then from his rivals, and now he was saving her from himself. The realization did not lessen the ache of his absence, but it reshaped it into something she could bear, a shared sacrifice. She started to build a life within the confines of her new reality. She enrolled in an online architecture course, spending her nights studying blueprints and design principles, pouring her energy into the dream she thought had died. The sterile apartment slowly began to bear her mark. Books on the shelves, sketches pinned to the walls, the same resilient succulent from her old life now sitting in a pool of sunlight on the wide windowsill. She was no longer just surviving his world. She was carving out a space for her own within it. The fear was gone, replaced by a steely resolve. She was a woman who had walked through a storm and found herself standing, changed but unbroken, in the quiet aftermath. The last time she saw the estate, she was standing by the grand foyer window, watching the first snow of the season begin to fall, blanketing the city in a soft, white silence. She had submitted her resignation that morning, a simple, formal note left on the desk of the new house manager. It was not an act of escape, but an act of self-possession. She knew he would not stop her. She felt his gaze from the shadows of the upper landing, a silent, final acknowledgement. The echo of everything they had never said, the gratitude, the fear, the impossible connection, filled the space between them. The silence was no longer empty. It was a language all its own, a quiet testament to the man who broke his own rules and the woman who learned to live with the consequences. 5 years passed, each one a brick she used to build a new life on a foundation he had cleared for her. Elena was no longer a ghost in someone else's home. She was an architect in her own right, a creator of spaces filled with light and purpose. She now moved through the clean, sunlit offices of a prestigious firm, her limp a forgotten memory, her hands, once raw from polish and cleaning fluids, now confidently sketching blueprints for schools and community centers. The quiet endurance that had defined her survival was now the bedrock of her strength. The dark opulence of the Romano estate felt like a chapter from another woman's story, a haunting but distant prelude to the life she had painstakingly constructed for herself, one measured line at a time. The past was not erased, but it had been repurposed, its shadows giving depth to the light she now commanded. Her latest project, a public library for a neglected inner-city neighborhood, was her passion. It was a design born from her own history, a sanctuary of quiet, a place of escape and opportunity built with steel and glass. To secure the final funding, she had to present her proposal at the annual Civic Benefactors Gala, a glittering event held in the grand ballroom of a historic hotel. Dressed in a simple, elegant, dark blue gown, she felt a strange sense of dislocation. The room was filled with the city's elite, the very same strata of power and wealth she had once served invisibly. She was an outsider who had earned a seat at the table, and as she stood near the stage, preparing her speech, she felt the familiar, prickling sensation on the back of her neck, an awareness she had not felt in years. She turned slowly, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. Across the sea of champagne glasses and polite conversation, she saw him. Don Alessio Romano stood near a marble column, a figure of quiet authority who still commanded the space around him without a word. He was older, the lines around his eyes deeper, the silver at his temples more pronounced. He was not looking at anyone else. His dark, unblinking gaze was fixed entirely on her. The noise of the ballroom faded into a dull roar, the crowd of people dissolving into a blur. In that single, sustained look, 5 years of silence were annihilated. She saw everything in his eyes, the memory of the storm, the weight of his choices, and a profound, weary acknowledgement of the woman she had become. It was not a look of possession, but of release. When her name was called, she walked to the podium with a composure she did not feel. She spoke of light, of safety, of creating spaces where people could build their own futures. All the while she felt his gaze on her, a silent, steadying presence. She never looked his way again. Later, as the city's mayor announced the project's benefactors, a final, stunning announcement was made. An anonymous donor had just come forward, pledging the full remaining amount required to begin construction immediately. The donation was made with a single stipulation, that the project be built exactly as designed without compromise. A wave of applause filled the room, but Elena heard none of it. She knew. It was his answer to her speech, his final, silent word in their long, unspoken conversation. She saw him leave, a quiet departure that went unnoticed by the celebrating crowd. He did not look back. He simply slipped through a side exit and was gone, absorbed back into the city's shadows. He had not offered her a single word, nor she him. None were needed. His act was not a gift to bind her to him, but a final, definitive severing of the old debt. He was no longer just a destroyer. He was using the immense, dark power he wielded to build something beautiful, something permanent, something she had dreamed into existence. It was his penance and her liberation, a silent, shared act of redemption that washed them both clean. He had protected her life, and now he had consecrated her dream. She was finally, truly, free. Standing alone by the tall windows overlooking the glittering city, Elena touched the cool glass, her reflection a pale ghost against the night. She was no longer a victim, and he was no longer just a monster. They were two souls, marked by a violent, tender moment in time, who had found their own separate peace in the echo of what they had been to each other. He had given her a future, and she had given him a flicker of humanity to carry back into the darkness. Their story was a testament to the fact that even in the deepest shadows, a single act of courage can build a cathedral of light. If their journey has moved you, show your support by liking this story, sharing it with someone who needs to see it, and telling us in the comments what you believe true redemption looks like.